This is True Beginner. It's the once-a-month series where I show a new woodworker how to do basic woodworking tasks around the shop. This is Nate, he's my editor, and you'd say you're an inexperienced woodworker, right Nate?
Absolutely.
And last month, we did a video where I showed him all the basic hand planing techniques, especially how to set up and use a number 4 plane, just for general stuff. And that video was very popular, but a lot of people got in touch and said, hey, all that stuff you said about the curved, cambered iron and how it's sharpened and everything, we need a video about that. There's a lot of important information there we don't understand. So in today's video, we're going to take you through the complete setup of an iron. This is going to apply either to a new iron or to a used one. I pulled this out of a farm fresh flea market plane this morning. I've done nothing to it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand it to Nate. I am not going to touch it for the rest of the video, and we're going to take you through all the steps of sharpening using sandpaper. Sometimes this is called the scary sharp method, but really it's just a quick and cheap way of getting your irons sharp using nothing but common abrasive papers. So Nate, are you ready to go?
Yeah.
Do you have any questions before we start?
This would cut pretty cleanly through an artery, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I guess.
All right, what do we need to start sharpening an iron?
Okay, so there's not a lot of equipment necessary just to get going with this. We're mostly going to be using sandpaper on a flat surface. My flat surface is this piece of glass. There's a bunch of different alternatives for that. You could get just regular window glass. It doesn't have to be really thick. Or you could get a granite tile down at the home center, or some people even use a shelf like out of an IKEA bookcase. If you can put a straight edge across it and it's flat, then it's good enough. Any flat surface will get this done. And then for the actual sharpening, we're going to use sandpaper. I have glued a big piece of 220 grit sandpaper to the back here, and then you can see I've got little squares of this darker colored sandpaper. This is automotive wet dry sandpaper. You can order it online or you can get it at any auto parts store. And this stuff is special because it's very durable and it comes in super fine grits. So this comes all the way up to like 4,000 grit. We're just going to use a couple of grits. We're going to use 400, 600, 1,000, and 1,500. So if you have 3 or 4 different grits of this, you're going to be good to go.
Why so many different grits of sandpaper?
Because each stage of sharpening would take a lot of time if you had to take the iron, say, all the way from a rough iron to 1,000. You could do all of that on 1,000 grit paper, but it would literally take you like an hour.
Okay.
So if you have a progression of grits, the scratches in the blade get finer and finer, and it gets less and less aggressive as the surface gets more refined. So by the time you get to this like 1,500 grit, which is our finest, it's already almost at 1,500 because the previous stage was 1,000 grit.
Okay.
So you're not trying to get all the way there using a super fine grit.
Yeah.
And so then you got a flat surface and some abrasive paper, and then you also want a honing jig. A lot of people don't use these when they're more experienced as woodworkers, but when you're first starting out, the jig is perfect. It takes so much guesswork out, and it's like $5. And then I've also got my little Craig measuring stick here, and that allows us to actually set up the jig because it's all determined on projection and stuff like that.
And then is this an actually workable iron? Because it looks, I would look at this and say it looks pretty jacked up. There's a little rust here. It's got, I don't even know what to call that, but yeah, if I had to buy this on my own, I would not choose this.
Nate, I'm sorry. You're using all the wrong terms here. Tool snobs, we call that patina. That's the beauty of age on the tool.
Okay.
So
this is a fine wine.
This is aged like fine wine. Let me show it up to the camera here a little bit, and you can see that the edge is not in good shape, and the patina that he's talking about, rust is another totally good word for it. What you would want to look out for on a blade like this, on any piece of metal, is pitting. So if you look over here, there's actually little holes in the iron.
Yes.
Where the rust has eaten through the surface. I'll show that to the camera too. Right here, there's a little bit of pitting. I don't have any pitting near the actual cutting surface, and so that's fine. I should also mention that everything I'm doing to this used iron would also apply if you bought an inexpensive new iron that maybe didn't come fantastic from the factory, all these steps would still apply, although it would probably be in better condition than this one is.
Okay, so it's got a nice patina. Where, so then, what
Grit?
grit, yes, what grit do we start on then?
So the thing you have to understand is that sharpening actually happens in 2 stages. Stage number 1 is called grinding, and stage number 2 is called honing. When you're grinding your iron, you're not trying to get a fine slicing edge on it, you're trying to get the geometry straightened out. We were looking at this iron a little bit before the video started, and it's got a little dip in it right here. It's kind of hollow, which is not good, and the bevel is very rough and it's not even. The first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna grind the edge of this so that it's perfectly perpendicular to the edges and square, and we have a clean, flat bevel. I would usually do this over at the powered bench grinder, but if you don't have one of those, it's no problem. That's why I put 220 grit, regular woodworking sandpaper on the bottom of this piece of glass. What we're gonna do now is we're gonna take this iron, we're gonna load it up in our jig, we're gonna set the projection for 25 degrees. In this case, that means a 50 millimeter projection, and our little measuring stick is perfect for checking that projection. And then we're gonna be able to put the iron and the jig right down on that sandpaper and start grinding it back and forth to grind away the old rusty steel and reveal the clean new steel. The fact that our iron is only shiny back there, it means the bevel is not a good shape. Okay. What we need to do is keep grinding until that shiny spot goes all the way to the edge. All right. So you're gonna go back to the sandpaper and grind probably for a while, and you're gonna move around a lot on different parts of the paper so that you don't totally wear out any spot on the paper. Okay, so now our iron has been ground on the front and the geometry is really good, but the thing that we haven't done yet is prepare the back of the iron. So if you look at the back, it's very rusty looking and it's probably not as flat as it needs to be. If you look at an iron in a plane, it's actually the back of the iron that does the cutting. So it's just as important to smooth out and polish that back as it is to work on the bevel. Now Nate, what I want you to do is take the iron, kind of like this, like my hand. What you're gonna do is you're gonna push the iron back and forth on the paper while giving nice downward pressure with the tips of your fingers. And you're gonna flip it over from time to time, and the rust versus the shiny metal will tell you where you've made progress. When it's shiny all the way across, then the back is flat and you can stop. So how long have you been working on the back of the iron at this point?
I'd say about a minute or two.
And what do you see when you look at the back?
Most of it is shiny, but there's this spot that's still dark. And so my guess would be that it's lower in the iron so the sandpaper isn't catching it.
Yep. And so the thing that's important is you only really need to worry about this last ½ inch.
Okay.
Because that's the part that's actually going to be contacting the wood, and that's where the chip breaker sits.
Yeah.
So as you're working, go ahead and concentrate the pressure of your fingers right at the edge. We're gonna rotate our paper, and we might even change out for a fresh piece of paper. This piece is getting pretty loaded up with metal and rust. We might need a fresh piece, but we need to keep working on the back until this corner is just as shiny as the rest of the blade. So now that we've ground the bevel and flattened the back, the blade should be all set. Our jig should have made sure that everything is square and all the angles are perfect. But this is a great time to check. So we're gonna check both of those things. We're gonna start with a protractor, and again, this is totally optional, but I've set my protractor to 25 degrees. Your blade angle does not have to be exactly 25 degrees, but it's a really good starting place. A couple degrees in either direction won't make any difference. You can slide the blade in there and see if the angle of it is a true 25.
Yes, it is.
Okay, so we've got our 25-degree angle, which is great. If it was 27 or 23, wouldn't make any difference. It's in the ballpark. That's all we care about. The next thing we want to know is the blade square? So I have a little tiny square here. These are pretty accurate and not very expensive, and you can register that against the side of the plane iron and then use the light to see if the end is square. And I'm sure it's going to be square.
It's not square.
It's not square?
It's not square.
Where is it out of square?
At this angle, I'm getting a little light out of the left side.
So it's a little bit on the left side. Okay, so this actually happens all the time. These little jigs are good, but they're hardly foolproof. They only have this one little pivot point in the back, and if you're sharpening away on this thing, it's really easy to push a tiny bit harder on one side and grind away a little bit more material. Nate just did a ton of grinding, so the fact that he's a little bit out of square, totally not surprising. We're going to put the blade back in the jig, make sure the projection is set up correctly. We're going to grind it a little bit more, just putting a tiny bit of extra hand pressure where there's extra material. We'll check it again with the square, and then when we know it's square, we're going to flip our glass over and start going to our fine grits of wet and dry paper. We're going to keep working on the back. We're going to start at the 400 grit, which is the coarsest, and we're going to work across that back, moving to finer and finer grits of paper until the back of the iron is perfectly polished and shiny all the way across.
All right, the back looks amazing. It's a total 180 from where it used to be.
Is it actually like, oh, it's like literally mirror polished. I can see myself in it. You did a really good job.
Thank you. But it took a while, it felt like.
Yeah, it takes a long time, especially with an old blade like that.
Every time I need to resharpen the iron, is that something I'm going to need to do?
Oh, okay, I totally should have explained this. So what we're doing right now is we're preparing both the bevel and the back of the iron. The back only has to be prepared once. So you need to do this when you're restoring a plane, and you also need to do it with a new iron if it's not super high quality. The high-end ones come really well prepared. A cheaper iron is not going to come like that. You have to flatten the back and polish it, but you really only have to do that one time.
And then what is the next step after this then?
So now we have a blade that's been prepared. The bevel is ground and the back is polished. The grinding phase is over, and now we're going to move on to honing. And honing is what we do over and over again throughout our woodworking day. What we basically have here is a blade that everything is good, the geometry is good, but it's dull. It's not sharp yet. And honing is what's going to turn that good geometry into a really sharp bevel. So we're going to put it back in the jig. We're going to go over to our wet and dry paper, and we're going to start honing it on the coarsest grit of paper. We're going to have to put a little bit of water on there. Water is really important when you're honing because it floats off the little particles of metal, and it's going to keep that paper from getting clogged up. It's going to cut longer and last longer. This is why we're using wet or dry paper. It's made to be used with water, and the paper won't dissolve and fall apart.
Since there's no longer a way for me to tell how shiny it's getting, how am I going to know when I need to switch over to another grit?
Oh, that's a really important question. There's two answers to that. A lot of people, when they're sharpening, they'll actually grab a magic marker and they will color in the bevel, and where that marker gets ground away, where it's shiny again, you know you've already honed there. That's a really great beginner's trick that you're not going to need for very long. The more important thing is once you've finished honing on one grit, you're going to feel a burr.
Okay.
And I probably need to explain that really quickly. I've got a piece of wood here. Let's just assume this is a plain blade. This is the back that we just finished, and this is the bevel. And what's going to happen is we've already gotten the back all nice and shiny and polished, and as we're honing and polishing up that bevel, it's actually going to create a little flap of metal that's going to hang over like this, because we have two really perfect surfaces that are meeting, and that leftover metal is going to be here. When you run your thumb over the edge of that blade, you're going to be able to feel a tiny little burr. That means you're done. You can't get anything else done on that grit. When you have that feeling and you've got that burr, you're going to go to your next piece of sandpaper, your next finer piece. Put the blade flat against it and give it a little pull. What that's going to do is it's going to take that burr from here on the back and it's going to flip it over to the front. Then when we go to hone this again, we're going to hone off that burr and continue to refine and polish this bevel.
All right, I've worked on a couple of the grits. I was able to feel the burr and get rid of it on the next grit up. What about the slight curve that we were working for?
Yeah, right. So the camber of the blade. This is really important to making any plane, but especially a smoothing plane function. You've got to have that little bit of curvature. And you don't really have to worry about it until you get to the honing phase.
Okay.
What you're going to do now, because your blade is perfectly flat and straight, is when you're down there honing on that abrasive paper, you're just going to put a little bit of extra pressure with your right hand and concentrate there for a few strokes. Then you're going to switch and put extra pressure with your left hand and concentrate there for a few strokes. We're going to do that on all of the grits as we're sharpening, and we're going to slowly create that curve. Then, of course, we want to check and see if we've actually done it. We're going to grab a wooden ruler because it's not going to mess up the blade, and we'll hold that up to the iron, up to the light. And what we should see is a little tiny bit of light at either corner of the blade and no light in the middle. If you've got no light in the middle and a little bit at either corner, then your blade is cambered. At that point, when it's been honed and cambered and polished, we're ready for the ultra last step before we actually try it on some wood.
Okay, well, I used all the grits. I checked to make sure that I had a camber, but now I have a burr left over from the last grit. What do I do with that?
Yeah, so when you finish with your finest grit of whatever honing you're using, you're going to have a burr left over, and that's what you need a strop for. Okay, so this is really simple. For most people, I recommend you don't buy one because they're too easy to make. This is a piece of MDF, but you could use plywood too, with just a scrap of leather. My wife was throwing away a handbag, and so I grabbed that and I cut a piece of leather. I put it on here with the fuzzy side up, just with some contact cement, and then I just went online and I bought this buffing compound. It's green buffing compound, and this is chromium oxide, so it's chromium and oxygen, and it's in a wax binder, and it's used for buffing stainless steel. So it's perfect for this, and what you just do is you rub it across the strop, and that puts that really, really fine chromium oxide abrasive into the grain of the leather, and we're going to use that to remove that last burr.
Okay.
We're going to put this into our woodworking vise, or you could just have it on the table with a little piece of rubber mat underneath it. We're going to put the bevel on the strop, and we're going to pull it back towards ourselves really firmly, being really careful not to come off of the back edge because that'll ruin it. So we're going to start, we're going to pull back, and come off again. We're going to do that 20 times with firm pressure. Then we're going to flip the blade over, we're going to put the back on the strop, and we're going to drag it backwards 10 or 15 times with firm pressure. Then we should have the most polished, perfect edge, and we're ready to test it. Okay, Nate, you have sharpened it. You get to try it out. This is, we didn't futz around with it off camera. This is the first shot. Let's see if this thing works. Oh, that sounded good. What do we get?
I got this.
Oh, look at that! That sounds beautiful. Oh, I gotta get in there. Let me get a piece of this.
Yeah.
Oh, this is gonna be great. Make it even nicer. Woo!
Oh my god.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was amazing, and I did all this work, and it came out beautifully. Do I have to do all of that again, though, anytime I need to resharpen?
Now, that's a really good question. So, no, you don't have to do all that stuff. What we did was we ground the iron and prepared the iron and honed the iron. So this is now going to be good for hours of work. But once your plane isn't cutting quite as smoothly, maybe you're not getting a good surface, then it's time to hone again. So we'll pull out the iron and we'll only go through the fine grits. Whatever you're using, whether you're using sandpaper or stones, you're just going to go through a couple of grits to refresh that edge. Then strop it and put it back in again. I've been doing this for a long time. I can sharpen really quickly. And if I'm using two different planes, I might sharpen 4 or 5 times a day, but it doesn't really interrupt my workflow because it only takes me like a minute or two to sharpen. So I pull the iron out, I hone it really quickly, I strop it, I put it back in, and I get right to work. It's not a big deal.
So aside from getting rid of the burr, we're only ever working the bevel.
Yeah, so exactly. So now that we've prepared the back, we don't have to worry about the back in the future. We're really just going to concentrate on the bevel. That's the part that's in contact with the shaving and gets dulled through the work.
Okay, cool. And I happen to know that you don't actually do sandpaper sharpening yourself, and you actually kind of
I think it's stupid. I think it's dumb.
Yeah.
So sometimes you'll hear people talk about scary sharp. That's actually the term they use, scary sharp, which is just a way somebody once used to describe sandpaper sharpening, which is all we're doing here. And somebody wrote an article years ago where they said they got their irons scary sharp with sandpaper. And frankly, this is completely stupid because sandpaper is an abrasive. Any stone that you use or any diamond plate you use is also an abrasive. There's nothing magical about sandpaper. It doesn't get your stuff any sharper. Now, what's good about sandpaper is that it's really inexpensive. So if you want to get started woodworking, you can get a couple grits of wet or dry paper for a few bucks a piece, maybe 12, 15 bucks at the auto parts store for 3 or 4 grits of wet or dry paper. The chromium oxide we use for the strop, that costs like $4. We'll put a link to that and everything else down in the description. Leather is free. The glass you use to sharpen on, that can be free. You can get going for like almost no money. But I bet you probably can see what the problem is with this.
You'd have to keep buying those sandpapers over and over and over and over and over.
So we could probably only sharpen one more iron on that sandpaper before it has to be replaced. We would work through those initial packets of wet dry sandpaper really quickly. And if it costs us $12 or $15 every time we buy sandpaper, really quickly, the economics of it don't line up anymore. So next month, on our next episode of True Beginner, I'm going to teach you about oilstone sharpening. That's my favorite technique for a way to sharpen that's durable and cost-effective over the long run.
Excellent.
So what's the other thing that we have cooking around here right now?
We have a new e-newsletter coming out.
What's it called?
It's called Fabrication First.
And when does it come out, Nate?
The first of every month.
So it's called Fabrication First. It comes out on the first of every month, and it's going to have articles about craft-related topics. It's going to have coupons and deals on plans. It's going to have recommended tools and a bunch of other stuff. You can go to rexkruger.com to sign up for that, or you can click the link down in the description. And just like always, none of this would be possible. Nate couldn't even be sitting here without my patrons on Patreon. Their support makes these videos possible. They turned this from a hobby into a full-time job for me. They are paying Nate's salary. He is here because of the patrons. So if you would like to be part of the amazing community of craftspeople that makes these videos possible, go on over to
patreon.com/rexkruger
and check out all the rewards and extra benefits that I have for the people who support our work. Thank you everybody so much for being here. We can't wait to come back and do this again. Thanks for watching.